The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 1, Side 2. He pleased the Byzantine Senate by his modest observance of its traditions and prerogatives. He rose from his seat to greet the consuls, and in general played the Augustan game of holding himself a servant and delegate of the senators and the people. When inadvertently he infringed a senatorial privilege, he fined himself 10 pounds of gold, and declared that he was subject like his fellow citizens to the laws and forms of the Republic. From morn till night he toiled at the tasks of government, except for an intermission in the afternoon, which he reserved for study. His light diet, we are told, gave his body and mind a nervous agility that passed swiftly from one business or visitor to another, and exhausted 3 secretaries every day. He performed with assiduity and interest the functions of a judge, exposed the sophistry of advocates, yielded with grace to the sustained opinions of judges against his own, and impressed everyone with the righteousness of his decisions. He reduced the taxes levied upon the poor, refused the gift of gold crowns traditionally offered by each province to a new emperor, excused Africa from accumulated arrears, and remitted the excessive tribute heretofore exacted from the Jews. He made stricter and strictly enforced the requirements for a license to practice medicine. His success as an administrator crowned his triumph as a general. His fame, says Ammianus, gradually spread until it filled the whole world. Amid all these activities of government, his ruling passion was philosophy, and his never-forgotten purpose was to restore the ancient cults. He gave orders that the pagan temples should be repaired and opened, that their confiscated property should be restored, and their accustomed revenues renewed. He dispatched letters to the leading philosophers of the day, inviting them to come and live as his guests at his court. When Maximus arrived, Julian interrupted the address he was making to the Senate, ran at full speed to greet his old teacher, and introduced him with grateful praise. Maximus took advantage of the emperor's enthusiasm, assumed ornate robes and luxurious ways, and was subjected after Julian's death to severe scrutiny of the means by which he had acquired so rapidly such unbecoming wealth. Julian took no notice of these contradictions. He loved philosophy too much to be dissuaded from it by the conduct of philosophers. "If anyone," he wrote to Eumenius, "has persuaded you that there is anything more profitable to the human race than to pursue philosophy at one's leisure without interruptions, he is a deluded man trying to delude you." He loved books, carried a library with him on his campaigns, vastly enlarged the library that Constantine had founded, and established others. "Some men," he wrote, "have a passion for horses, others for birds, others for wild beasts. But I from childhood have been possessed by a passionate longing to acquire books." Proud to be an author as well as a statesman, he sought to justify his policies with dialogues in the manner of Lucian, or orations in the style of Libanius, letters almost as fresh and charming as Cicero's, and formal philosophical treatises. In a hymn to a king's son he expounded his new paganism. In an essay against the Galileans, he gave his reasons for abandoning Christianity. "The Gospels," he writes in a preview of higher criticism, "contradict one another, and agree chiefly in their incredibility. The Gospel of John differs substantially from the other 3 in narrative and theology, and the creation story of Genesis assumes a plurality of gods. Unless every one of these legends of Genesis is a myth, involving, as I indeed believe, some secret interpretation, they are filled with blasphemies against God. In the first place, he is represented as ignorant because she who was created to be a helpmate to Adam would be the cause of man's fall. Secondly, to refuse to man a knowledge of good and evil, which knowledge alone gives coherence to the human mind, and to be jealous lest man should become immortal by partaking of the tree of life, this is to be an exceedingly grudging and envious God. Why is your God so jealous, even avenging the sins of the fathers upon the children? Why is so mighty a God so angry against demons, angels, and men? Compare his behavior with the mildness even of Lycurgus and the Romans towards transgressors. The Old Testament, like paganism, sanctioned and required animal sacrifice. Why do you not accept the law which God gave the Jews? You assert that the earlier law was limited in time and place. But I could quote to you from the books of Moses not merely 10 but 10,000 passages where he says that the law is for all time. When Julian sought to restore paganism, he found it not only irreconcilably diverse in practice and creed, but far more permeated with incredible miracle and myth than Christianity, and he realized that no religion can hope to win and move the common soul unless it clothes its moral doctrine in a splendor of marvel, legend, and ritual. He was impressed by the antiquity and universality of myths. One could no more discover when myth was originally invented than one could find out who was the first man that sneezed. He resigned himself to mythology and condoned the use of myths to instill morality into unlettered minds. He himself told again the story of Cybele, and how the Great Mother had been carried in the form of a black stone from Phrygia to Rome. And no one could surmise from his narrative that he doubted the divinity of the stone or the efficacy of its transference. He discovered the need of sensory symbolism to convey spiritual ideas, and adopted the Mithraic worship of the sun as a religious counterpart among the people of the philosopher's devotion to reason and light. It was not difficult for this poet-king to pen a hymn to Helios, king sun, source of all life, author of countless blessings to mankind. This, he suggested, was the real Logos, or divine word, that had created and now sustained the world. To this supreme principle and first cause Julian added the innumerable deities and genii of the old pagan creeds. A tolerant philosopher, he thought, would not strain at swallowing them all. It would be a mistake to picture Julian as a free-thinker replacing myth with reason. He denounced atheism as bestial, and taught doctrines as supernatural as can be found in any creed. Seldom has a man composed such nonsense as in Julian's hymn to the sun. He accepted the Neoplatonist Trinity, identified Plato's creative archetypal ideas with the mind of God, considered them as the intermediary logos or wisdom by which all things had been made, and looked upon the world of matter and body as a devilish impediment to the virtue and liberation of the imprisoned soul. Through piety, goodness, and philosophy, the soul might free itself, rise to the contemplation of spiritual realities and laws, and so be absorbed in the Logos, perhaps in the ultimate God himself. The deities of polytheism were in Julian's belief impersonal forces. He could not accept them in their popular anthropomorphic forms, but he knew that the people would seldom mount to the abstractions of the philosopher or the mystic visions of the saint. In public and private, he practiced the old rituals and sacrificed so many animals to the gods that even his admirers blushed for his holocausts. During his campaigns against Persia, he regularly consulted the omens after the fashion of Roman generals, and listened carefully to the interpreters of his dreams. He seems to have credited the magic-mongering of Maximus. Like every reformer, he thought that the world needed a moral renovation, and to this end he designed no mere external legislation, but a religious approach to the inner hearts of men. He had been deeply moved by the symbolism of the mysteries at Eleusis and Ephesus. No ceremony seemed to him better fitted to inspire a new and nobler life. And he hoped that these impressive rites of initiation and consecration might be extended from an aristocratic few to a large proportion of the people. According to Libanius, he wished rather to be called a priest than an emperor. He envied the ecclesiastical hierarchy of Christianity, its devoted priests and women, the communalism of its worship, the binding persuasiveness of its charity. He was not above imitating the better aspects of a religion which he hoped to supplant and destroy. He called new blood into the pagan priesthood, organized a pagan church with himself as its head, and importuned his clergy to rival and surpass the Christian ministry in providing instruction to the people, distributing alms to the poor, offering hospitality to strangers, and giving examples of the good life. He established in every town schools for lectures and expositions of the pagan faith. To his pagan priests he wrote like a Francis to fellow monks. "Act towards me as you think I should act towards you. If you like, let us make this compact, that I am to point out to you what are my views concerning all your affairs, and you in return are to do the same for me concerning my sayings and doings. Nothing, in my opinion, could be more valuable for us than this reciprocity. We ought to share our money with all men, but more generally with the good and the helpless and the poor. And I will assert, though it will seem paradoxical, that it would be a pious act to share our clothes and food even with the wicked. For it is to the humanity in a man that we give, and not to his moral character." This pagan was a Christian in everything but creed, and as we read him and discount his dead mythology, we suspect that he owed many lovable developments of his character to the Christian ethic which had been poured into him in childhood and early youth. How then did he behave to the religion in which he had been reared? He allowed Christianity full freedom of preaching, worship, and practice, and recalled the Orthodox bishops exiled by Constantius. He withdrew from the Christian Church all state subsidies, and closed to Christians the chairs of rhetoric, philosophy, and literature in the universities, on the ground that these subjects could be taught with sympathy only by pagans. He extended the exemption of the Christian clergy from taxation and burdensome civic duties, and the free use by the bishops of the facilities supplied for the public post. He forbade legacies to churches, made Christians ineligible to governmental offices, ordered the Christians of each community to make full reparation for any damage that they had inflicted upon pagan temples during preceding reigns, and permitted the demolition of Christian churches that had been built upon the illegally seized lands of pagan shrines. When confusion, injustice, and riots resulted from this precipitate logic, Julian sought to protect the Christians, but he refused to change his laws. He was capable of sarcasm hardly becoming a philosopher when he reminded certain Christians who had suffered violence that their scriptures exhort them to support their misfortunes with patience. Christians who reacted to these laws with insults or violence were severely punished. Pagans who took to violence or insults in dealing with Christians were handled with leniency. In Alexandria, the pagan populace had nursed a special hatred for that Arian Bishop George who had taken Athanasius' see. When he provoked them by a public procession satirizing the Mithraic rites, they seized him and tore him to pieces. And though few Christians cared to defend him, many Christians were killed or wounded in the attendant disorders, this in 362. Julian wished to punish the rioters, but his advisers prevailed upon him to content himself with a letter of strong protest to the people of Alexandria. Athanasius now came out of hiding and resumed his episcopal seat. Julian protested that this was done without consulting him and ordered Athanasius to retire. The old prelate obeyed, but in the following year the emperor died and the patriarch, symbol of the triumphant Galileans, returned to his see. 10 years later, aged 80, he passed away, rich in honors and scars. In the end, Julian's passionate perseverance defeated his program. Those whom he injured fought him with subtle pertinacity. Those whom he favored responded with indifference. Paganism was spiritually dead. It no longer had in it any stimulus to youth, any solace to sorrow, any hope beyond the grave. Some converts came to it, but mostly in expectation of political advancement or imperial gold. Some cities restored the official sacrifices, but only in payment for favors. At Pessinus itself, home of Cybele, Julian had to bribe the inhabitants to honor the Great Mother. Many pagans interpreted paganism to mean a good conscience in pleasure. They were disappointed to find Julian more Puritan than Christ. This supposed freethinker was the most pious man in the state, and even his friends felt it a nuisance to keep pace with his devotions. Or they were skeptics who, not too privately, smiled at his outmoded deities and solicitous hecatombs. The custom of sacrificing animals on altars had almost died out in the East, and in the West outside of Italy. People had come to think of it as a disgrace or a mess. Julian called his movement Hellenism, but the word repelled the pagans of Italy, who scorned anything Greek that was not dead. He relied too much on philosophical argument, which never reached to the emotional bases of faith. His works were intelligible only to the educated, who were too educated to accept them. His creed was an artificial syncretism that struck no roots in the hopes or fancies of men. Even before he died, his failure had become evident, and the army that loved and mourned him named a Christian to succeed to his throne. 5. Journey's End. His last great dream was to rival Alexander and Trajan, to plant the Roman standards in the Persian capitals, and end once and for all the Persian threat to the security of the Roman Empire. Eagerly he organized his army, chose his officers, repaired the frontier fortresses, provisioned the towns that would mark his route to victory. In the fall of 362 he came to Antioch and gathered his troops. The merchants of the city took advantage of the influx to raise prices. The people complained that everything is plentiful, but everything is dear. Julian called in the economic leaders and pled with them to restrain their profit-seeking. They promised but did not perform. And at last he appointed a fair price for everything and made it known to all men. Perhaps to force prices down, he had 400,000 modii, or pecks of corn, brought in from other cities in Syria and Egypt. The merchants protested that his prices made profit impossible. They secretly bought up the imported corn, took it and their goods to other towns, and Antioch found itself with much money and no food. Soon the populace denounced Julian for his interference. The wits of Antioch made fun of his beard and of his laborious attendance upon dead gods. He replied to them in a pamphlet, Misopagon, or Hater of Beards, whose wit and brilliance hardly became an emperor. He sarcastically apologized for his beard, and berated the Antiochians for their insolence, frivolity, extravagance, immorality, and indifference to the gods of Greece. The famous park called Daphne, once a sacred shrine of Apollo, had been changed into an amusement resort. Julian ordered the amusements ended and the shrine restored. This had hardly been completed when a fire consumed it. Suspecting Christian incendiarism, Julian closed the cathedral of Antioch and confiscated its wealth. Several witnesses were tortured, and a priest was put to death. The emperor's one consolation in Antioch was his feast of reason with Libanius. At last the army was ready, and in March 363 Julian began his campaign. He led his forces across the Euphrates, then across the Tigris, pursued the retreating Persians, but was harassed and almost frustrated by their scorched earth policy of burning all crops in their wake. Time and again his soldiers were near starvation. In this exhausting campaign the emperor showed his best qualities. He shared every hardship with his men, ate their scant fare or less, marched on foot through heat and flood, and fought in the front ranks in every battle. Persian women of youth and beauty were among his captives. He never disturbed their privacy, and allowed no one to dishonor them. Under his able generalship, his troops advanced to the very gates of Ctesiphon and laid siege to it. But the inability to get food compelled retreat. Shapur II chose 2 Persian nobles, cut off their noses, and bade them go to Julian in the guise of men who had deserted because of this cruel indignity, and lead him into a desert. They obeyed. Julian trusted them, and followed them with his army for 20 miles into a waterless waste. While he was extricating his men from this snare, they were attacked by a force of Persians. The attack was repulsed, and the Persians fled. Julian, careless of his lack of armor, was foremost in their pursuit. A javelin entered his side and pierced his liver. He fell from his horse and was carried to a tent, where his physicians warned him that he had but a few hours to live. Libanius alleged that the weapon came from a Christian hand, and it was noted that no Persian claimed the reward that Shapur had promised for the slaying of the emperor. Some Christians, like Sozomen, agreed with Libanius's account and praised the assassin who, for the sake of God and religion, had performed so bold a deed. The final scene, June 27th, 363, was in the tradition of Socrates and Seneca. Julian, says Ammianus, lying in his tent, addressed his disconsolate and sorrowing companions. Most opportunely, friends, has the time now come for me to leave this life, which I rejoice to restore to nature at her demand. All present wept, whereupon, even then maintaining his authority, he chided them, saying that it was unbecoming for them to mourn for a prince who was called for a union with heaven and the stars. As this made them all silent, he engaged with the philosophers Maximus and Priscus in an intricate discussion about the nobility of the soul. Suddenly the wound in his side opened wide, the pressure of the blood checked his breath, and after a draught of cold water for which he had asked, he passed away quietly in the 32nd year of his age. The story that he died exclaiming, "Thou hast conquered, Galilean," appears first in the Christian historian Theodoret in the 5th century, and is now unanimously rejected as a legend. The army, still in peril, required a commander, and its leaders chose Jovian, captain of the imperial guard. The new emperor made peace with Persia by surrendering 4 of the 5 satrapies that Diocletian had seized some 70 years before. Jovian persecuted no one, but he promptly transferred state support from the pagan temples to the church. The Christians of Antioch celebrated with public rejoicings the death of the pagan emperor. For the most part, however, the victorious Christian leaders preached to their congregations a generous forgetfulness of the injuries that Christianity had borne. 11 centuries would pass before Hellenism would have another day. Chapter 2. The Triumph of the Barbarians, 325 to 476. 1. The Threatened Frontier. Persia was but one sector of a 10,000-mile front through which at any point and at any moment this Roman Empire of 100 nations might be invaded by tribes unspoiled by civilization and envious of its fruits. The Persians in themselves were an insoluble problem. They were growing stronger, not weaker. Soon they would reconquer nearly all that Darius I had held 1,000 years before. West of them were the Arabs, mostly penniless Bedouins. The wisest statesmen would have smiled at the notion that these somber nomads were destined to capture half the Roman Empire and all Persia too. South of the Roman provinces in Africa were Ethiopians, Libyans, Berbers, Numidians, and Moors, who waited in fierce patience for the crumbling of imperial defenses or morale. Spain seemed safely Roman behind its forbidding mountains and protecting seas. None surmised that it would become in this 4th century German, and in the 8th Mohammedan. Gaul now surpassed Italy in Roman pride, in order and wealth, in Latin poetry and prose. But in every generation it had to defend itself against Teutons, whose women were more fertile than their fields. Only a small imperial garrison could be spared to protect Roman Britain from Scots and Picts on the west and north, and from Norse or Saxon pirates on the east or south. Norway's shores were a chain of pirate dens. Its people found war less toilsome than tillage, and counted the raiding of alien coasts a noble occupation for hungry stomachs or leisure days. In southern Sweden and its isles, the Goths claimed to have had their early home. Possibly they were indigenous to the region of the Vistula. In any case, they spread as Visigoths southward to the Danube, and as Ostrogoths they settled between the Dniester and the Don. In the heart of Europe, bounded by the Vistula, the Danube, and the Rhine, moved the restless tribes that were to remake the map and rename the nations of Europe. Thuringians, Burgundians, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, Gepidai, Quadi, Vandals, Alemanni, Suevi, Lombards, Franks. Against these ethnic tides, the empire had no protective wall except in Britain, but merely an occasional fort and garrison along the roads or rivers that marked the frontier limit, or limes, of the Roman realm. The higher birth rate outside the empire, and the higher standard of living within it, made immigration or invasion a manifest destiny for the Roman Empire then as for North America today. Perhaps we should modify the tradition that speaks of these German tribes as barbarians. It is true that in calling them Barbari, the Greeks and Romans meant no compliment. The word was probably brother to the Sanskrit Varvara, which meant a rough and letterless churl. It appears again in Berber. But it was not for nothing that for 5 centuries the Germans had touched Roman civilization in trade and war. By the 4th century they had long since adopted writing and a government of stable laws. If we accept the Merovingian Franks, their sexual morals were superior to those of the Romans and the Greeks. Our chief authority here is still the moralistic Tacitus in Germania, but compare a letter of Bishop Boniface, circa 756. In Old Saxony, if a virgin in her father's house or a married woman under the protection of her husband should be guilty of adultery, they burn her, strangled by her own hand, and hang her seducer over her grave. Or else, cutting off her garments to the waist, modest matrons whip her and pierce her with knives till they destroy her. An extreme device for pegging a price. Though they lacked the civility and graces of a cultured people, they often shamed the Romans by their courage, hospitality, and honesty. They were cruel, but hardly more so than the Romans. They were probably shocked to find that Roman law permitted the torturing of freemen to extort confessions or testimony. They were individualistic to the point of chaos, while the Romans had now been tamed to sociability and peace. In their higher ranks they showed some appreciation of literature and art. Stilicho, Ricimer, and other Germans entered fully into the cultural life of Rome, and wrote a Latin that Symmachus professed to enjoy. In general, the invaders, above all the Goths, were civilized enough to admire Roman civilization as higher than their own, and to aim rather at acquiring it than at destroying it. For 2 centuries they asked little more than admission to the empire and its unused lands, and they shared actively in its defense. If we continue to refer to the German tribes of the 4th and 5th centuries as barbarians, it will be in surrender to the convenience of custom, and with these reservations and apologies. South of the Danube and the Alps, the swelling tribes had already entered the empire by peaceable immigration, even by royal invitation. Augustus had begun the policy of settling barbarians within the frontier to replenish vacant areas and legions that the infertile and unmartial Romans no longer filled. And Aurelius, Aurelian, and Probus had adopted the plan. By the end of the 4th century, the Balkans and eastern Gaul were predominantly German. So was the Roman army. Many high offices, political as well as military, were in Teutonic hands. Once the empire had Romanized such elements, now the immigrants barbarized the Romans. Romans began to wear fur coats in barbarian style, and to let their hair flow long. Some even took to trousers, evoking outraged imperial decrees. The cue for the great invasion came from far-off Mongolian plains. The Xiongnu, or Huns, a division of the Turanian stock, occupied in our 3rd century the region north of Lake Balkhash and the Aral Sea. According to Jordanes, their chief weapon was their physiognomy. By the terror of their features they inspired great fear in those whom perhaps they did not really surpass in war. They made their foes flee in horror because their swarthy aspect was fearful, and they had a shapeless lump instead of a head, with pinholes rather than eyes. They are cruel to their children on the very day of their birth, for they cut the cheeks of the males with a sword, so that before they receive the nourishment of milk they must learn to endure wounds. Hence they grow old, beardless, and with faces scarred by the sword. They are short in stature, quick in bodily movement, alert horsemen, ready in the use of bow and arrow, broad-shouldered, and with firm-set necks always erect in pride. War was their industry, pasturing cattle was their recreation. Their country, said a proverb, is the back of a horse. Armed with arrows and knives, equipped with courage and speed, driven by the exhaustion of their lands and the pressure of their eastern enemies, they advanced into Russia about 355, overcame and absorbed the Alani, crossed the Volga, possibly in 372, and attacked the almost civilized Ostrogoths in the Ukraine. Ermanaric, the centenarian Ostrogothic king, fought bravely, was defeated, and died, some said, by his own hand. Part of the Ostrogoths surrendered and joined the Huns. Part fled west into the lands of the Visigoths, north of the Danube. A Visigothic army met the advancing Huns at the Dniester and was overwhelmed. A remnant of the Visigoths begged permission of the Roman authorities on the Danube to cross the river and settle in Mysia and Thrace. The Emperor Valens sent word that they should be admitted on condition that they surrender their arms and give up their youths as hostages. The Visigoths crossed and were shamelessly plundered by imperial officials and troops. Their girls and boys were enslaved by amorous Romans. But after diligent bribery, the immigrants were allowed to keep their arms. Food was sold them at famine prices, so that hungry Goths gave 10 pounds of silver or a slave for a joint of meat or a loaf of bread. At last the Goths were forced to sell their children into bondage to escape starvation. When they showed signs of revolt, the Roman general invited their leader Fritigern to a banquet, plotting to kill him. Fritigern escaped and roused the desperate Goths to war. They pillaged, burned, and killed until almost all Thrace was laid waste by their hunger and their rage. Valens hurried up from the east and met the Goths on the plains of Hadrianople with an inferior force, mostly composed of barbarians in the service of Rome. This in 378. The result, in the words of Ammianus, was the most disastrous defeat encountered by the Romans since Cannae, 594 years before. The Gothic cavalry prevailed over the Roman infantry, and from that day till the 14th century, the strategy and tactics of cavalry dominated the declining art of war. 2/3 of the Roman army perished. Valens himself was seriously wounded. The Goths set fire to the cottage in which he had taken refuge, and the emperor and his attendants died in the flames. The victorious horde marched upon Constantinople, but failed to pierce the defenses organized by Valens's widow, Dominica. The Visigoths, joined by Ostrogoths and Huns who crossed the unprotected Danube, ravaged the Balkans at will from the Black Sea to the borders of Italy. 2. The Savior Emperors, 364 to 408. In this crisis, the empire did not cease to produce able rulers. On Jovian's death, the army and senate had passed the crown to Valentinian, a blunt and Greekless soldier recalling Vespasian. With the consent of the senate, he had appointed his younger brother Valens as Augustus and emperor in the east, while he himself chose the apparently more dangerous west. He refortified the frontiers of Italy and Gaul, built up the army to strength and discipline, and again drove the encroaching Germans back across the Rhine. From his capital at Milan, he issued enlightened legislation forbidding infanticide, founding colleges, extending state medicine in Rome, reducing taxes, reforming a debased coinage, checking political corruption, and proclaiming freedom of creed and worship for all. He had his faults and his weaknesses. He was capable of cold cruelties to enemies, and if we may believe the historian Socrates, he legalized bigamy to sanction his marriage with Justina, whose beauty had been too generously described to him by his wife. Nevertheless, it was a tragedy for Rome that he died so soon, in 375. His son Gratian succeeded to his power in the west, lived up to his father for a year or two, then abandoned himself to amusements and the chase, and left the government to corrupt officials who put every office and judgment up for sale. The general Maximus overthrew him and invaded Italy in an effort to displace Gratian's successor and half-brother, Valentinian II. But the new emperor of the East, Theodosius I the Great, marched westward, defeated the usurper, and set the young Valentinian firmly on his Milan throne. This in 388. Theodosius was a Spaniard. He had distinguished himself as a general in Spain, Britain, and Thrace. He had persuaded the victorious Goths to join his army instead of fighting it. He had ruled the eastern provinces with every wisdom except tolerance, and half the world looked in awe at his astonishing assemblage of handsome features and majestic presence, ready anger and readier mercy, humane legislation and sternly orthodox theology. While he was wintering at Milan, a disturbance characteristic of the times broke out in Thessalonica. The imperial governor there, Botheric, had imprisoned for scandalous immorality a charioteer popular with the citizens. They demanded his release. Botheric refused. The crowd overcame his garrison, killed him and his aides, tore their bodies to pieces, and paraded the streets displaying the severed limbs as emblems of victory. The news of this outburst stirred Theodosius to fury. He sent secret orders that the entire population of Thessalonica should be punished. The people were invited into the hippodrome for games. Hidden soldiery fell upon them there and massacred 7,000 men, women, and children. This in 390. Theodosius sent a second order mitigating the first, but it came too late. The Roman world was shocked by this savage retaliation, and Ambrose, who administered with Stoic Christianity the See of Milan, wrote to the emperor that he, the bishop, could not again celebrate Mass in the imperial presence, until Theodosius should have atoned before all the people for his crime. Though privately remorseful, the emperor was reluctant to lower the prestige of his office by so public a humiliation. He tried to enter the cathedral, but Ambrose himself barred the way. After weeks of vain efforts, Theodosius yielded, stripped himself of all the insignia of empire, entered the cathedral as a humble penitent, and begged heaven to forgive his sins. This in 390. It was an historic triumph and defeat in the war between church and state. When Theodosius returned to Constantinople, Valentinian II, a lad of 20, proved inadequate to the problems that enmeshed him. His aides deceived him and took power into their venal hands. His master of the militia, the pagan Frank Arbogast, assumed imperial authority in Gaul, and when Valentinian went to Vienne to assert his sovereignty, he was assassinated in 392. Arbogast, inaugurating a long line of barbarian kingmakers, raised to the throne of the West a mild and manageable scholar. Eugenius was a Christian, but so intimate with the pagan parties in Italy that Ambrose feared him as another Julian. Theodosius marched westward again to restore legitimacy and orthodoxy with an army of Goths, Alani, Caucasians, Iberians, and Huns. Among its generals were the Goth Gainas, who would seize Constantinople, the Vandal Stilicho, who would defend Rome, and the Goth Alaric, who would sack it. In a 2-day battle near Aquileia, Arbogast and Eugenius were defeated, this in 394. Eugenius was surrendered by his soldiers and slain. Arbogast died by his own hand. Theodosius summoned his 11-year-old son Honorius to be emperor of the West, and named his 18-year-old son Arcadius as co-emperor of the East. Then, exhausted by his campaigns, he died at Milan in 395, in the 50th year of his age. The empire that he had repeatedly united was again divided, and except briefly under Justinian, it would never be united again. Theodosius's sons were effeminate weaklings nursed in an enfeebling security. Though their morals were almost as excellent as their intentions, they were not made to be pilots in a storm. They soon lost hold of affairs and surrendered administration and policy to their ministers. In the east, to the corrupt and avaricious Rufinus. In the west, to the able but unscrupulous Stilicho. In 398, this noble Vandal arranged the marriage of his daughter Maria to Honorius, hoping to be the grandfather as well as the father-in-law of an emperor. But Honorius proved to be as free of passion as of intellect. He spent his time feeding the imperial poultry with tender affection, and Maria died a virgin after having been for 10 years a wife. Theodosius had kept the Goths at peace by employing them in war, and by paying them an annual subsidy as allies. His successor refused to continue this subsidy, and Stilicho dismissed his Gothic troops. The idle warriors craved money and adventure, and their new leader, Alaric, provided both with a skill that outplayed the Romans in diplomacy as well as war. Why, he asked his followers, should the proud and virile Goth submit to be a hireling of effete Romans or Greeks, instead of using his own courage and his arms to cut out from the dying empire a kingdom of his own? In the very year of Theodosius's death, Alaric led almost the whole mass of Thracian Goths into Greece, marched unhindered through the pass of Thermopylae, massacred en route all men of military age, enslaved the women, ravaged the Peloponnesus, destroyed the temple of Demeter at Eleusis, and spared Athens only on receiving a ransom that absorbed most of the city's movable wealth, this in 396. Stilicho went to the rescue, but too late. He maneuvered the Goths into an indefensible position, but made truce with them when a revolution in Africa called him back to the west. Alaric signed an alliance with Arcadius, who allowed him to settle his Goths in Epirus. For 4 years, the empire was at peace. It was during those years that Synesius of Cyrene, half-Christian bishop and half-pagan philosopher, in an address before Arcadius's luxury-loving court at Constantinople, described with clarity and force the alternatives that faced Greece and Rome. How could the empire survive if its citizens continued to shirk military service and to entrust its defense to mercenaries recruited from the very nations that threatened it? He proposed an end to luxury and ease, and the enlistment or conscription of a citizen army aroused to fight for country and freedom. And he called upon Arcadius and Honorius to rise and smite the insolent barbarian hosts within the empire, and to drive them back to their lairs behind the Black Sea, the Danube, and the Rhine. The court applauded Synesius's address as an elegant oratorical exercise, and returned to its feasts. Meanwhile, Alaric compelled the armorers of Epirus to make for his Goths a full supply of pikes, swords, helmets, and shields. In 401 he invaded Italy, plundering as he came. Thousands of refugees poured into Milan and Ravenna, and then fled to Rome. Farmers took shelter within the walled towns, while the rich gathered whatever of their wealth they could move and frantically sought passage to Corsica, Sardinia, or Sicily. Stilicho denuded the provinces of their garrisons to raise an army capable of stemming the Gothic flood. And at Palencia, on Easter morning of 402, he pounced upon the Goths, who had interrupted pillage for prayer. The battle was indecisive. Alaric retreated, but ominously toward unprotected Rome, and only a massive bribe from Honorius persuaded him to leave Italy. The timid emperor, on Alaric's approach to Milan, had thought of transferring his capital to Gaul. Now he cast about for some safer place, and found it in Ravenna, whose marshes and lagoons made it impregnable by land and its shoals by sea. But the new capital trembled like the old when the barbarian Radagaisus led a host of 200,000 Alani, Quadi, Ostrogoths, and Vandals over the Alps and attacked the growing city of Florentia. Stilicho once more proved his generalship, defeated the motley horde with a relatively small army, and brought Radagaisus to Honorius in chains. Italy breathed again, and the imperial court of patricians, princesses, bishops, eunuchs, poultry, and generals resumed its routine of luxury, corruption, and intrigue. Olympius, the chancellor, envied and distrusted Stilicho. He resented the great general's apparent connivance at Alaric's repeated escapes, and thought he detected in him the secret sympathy of a German with German invaders. He protested against the bribes that on Stilicho's prompting had been paid or pledged to Alaric. Honorius hesitated to depose the man who for 23 years had led Rome's armies to victory and had saved the West. But when Olympius persuaded him that Stilicho was plotting to put his son on the throne, the timid youth consented to his general's death. Olympius at once sent a squad of soldiers to carry out the decree. Stilicho's friends wished to resist. He forbade them and offered his neck to the sword, this in 408. A few months later, Alaric re-entered Italy. 3. Italian background. The Western Roman Empire, toward the end of the 4th century, presented a complex picture of recovery and decline, of literary activity and sterility, of political pomp and military decay. Gaul prospered and threatened Italian leadership in every field. Of the approximately 70 million souls in the empire, 20 million or more were Gauls, hardly 6 million were Italians. The rest were mostly Greek-speaking Orientals. Rome itself, since 100 A.D., had been ethnically an Oriental city. Once Rome had lived on the east as modern Europe lived on its conquests and colonies till the middle of the 20th century. The legions had sucked the products and precious metals of a dozen provinces into the mansions and coffers of the victors. Now conquest was ended and retreat had begun. Italy was forced to depend upon its own human and material resources, and these had been dangerously reduced by family limitation, famine, epidemics, taxation, waste, and war. Industry had never flourished in the parasitic peninsula. Now that its markets were being lost in the east and Gaul, it could no longer support the urban population that had eked out doles by laboring in shops and homes. The collegia, or guilds, suffered from inability to sell their votes in a monarchy where voting was rare. Internal trade fell off, highway brigandage grew, and the once great roads, though still better than any before the 19th century, were crumbling into disrepair. The middle classes had been the mainstay of municipal life in Italy. Now they too were weakened by economic decline and fiscal exploitation. Every property owner was subject to rising taxes to support an expanding bureaucracy whose chief function was the collection of taxes. Satirists complained that those who live at the expense of the public funds are more numerous than those who provide them. Corruption consumed much of the taxes paid. 1,000 laws sought to discourage, detect, or punish the malversation of governmental revenue or property. Many collectors overtaxed the simple and kept the change. In recompense, they might ease the tax burdens of the rich for a consideration. The emperors labored to secure an honest collection. Valentinian I appointed in each town a defender of the city to protect citizens from the chicanery of the susceptores, and Honorius remitted the taxes of towns that were in financial straits. Nevertheless, if we may believe Salvian, some citizens fled across the frontier to live under barbarian kings who had not yet learned the full art of taxation. The agents of the treasury seemed more terrible than the enemy. Under these conditions, the incentives to parentage weakened and populations fell. Thousands of arable acres were left untilled, creating an economic vacuum that conspired with the surviving wealth of the cities to draw in the land-hungry barbarians. Many peasant proprietors, unable to pay their taxes or to defend their homes against invasion or robbery, turned their holdings over to richer or stronger landlords and became their coloni or cultivators. They bound themselves to give the lord a proportion of their produce, labor, and time in return for guaranteed subsistence and protection in peace and war. Thus Italy, which would never know full feudalism, was among the first nations to prepare its foundations. A like process was taking form in Egypt, Africa, and Gaul. Slavery was slowly declining. This book is continued on Cassette 2, Side 1.